So I wanted to begin this series of teachings on the Pali Canon by conveying or transmitting Buddha's first teaching, what's known as the turning of the wheel of Dharma. So this is the first teaching he gave after he had attained enlightenment. So it's auspicious and a good sign to start with this teaching. So this teaching is present in the Samyutta Nikaya. Again, I'm using Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, big book. We'll go through one sutra at a time. Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, I may be substituting some words here and there if there's something that's a bit simpler or clearer, more modern language, or there are different translations of some of these Pali terms. I'm more familiar with the translations that are used in the Kadampa Buddhist traditions. I may substitute sometimes, but the meaning is the same. So this teaching is Samyutta Nikaya 56.11, and so and it's abbreviated SN for Samyutta Nikaya 56.11. Samyutta means collected. Nikaya means discourses, teachings, something like that. And so the Pali Canon is divided into these 5 books called 5 Nikayas. The Digha Nikaya, the long discourses, the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses, the Samyutta Nikaya, the collected discourses, the Anguttara Nikaya, the sort of what's called the numerical discourses, a bunch of sets that are all numbered. And then there's a 5th book that is a collection of lots of other shorter teachings. But this Samyutta Nikaya is the main one that I'll be giving teachings on. It is, widely considered to be some of the oldest of Buddhist teachings, and very clear because each of these within the Samyutta Nikaya, most of the teachings are collected around particular topics. And so this one's SN 56.11. As I mentioned, there's a lot of teachings, right? So 56 means the 56th, what's called Samyutta, or the 56th collection, and then 11, the 11th sutra within this. And as I mentioned, big book, so it's on page 1843. So I'm going to read this. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There, the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5 in this way. So all of these sutras, they begin by indicating 4 points: where it was spoken, when it was spoken, who spoke it, and who were they speaking to. Now, these 4 points, they give the context, right? So here it just says at one time. So that's when. When is at one time, but sometimes it's more specific about what specific time. Where it was taught at Varanasi, it's a part of India. The Blessed One, as a speaker, was speaking to these 5 bhikkhus. So there's, of course, a longer explanation that could be given at some point, but prior to attaining enlightenment, Buddha had practiced with 5 ascetic monks, and they had practiced these, ascetic practices, mortifications, which means they had taken or pushed their body to extreme lengths, with the view that from that practice you can gain spiritual realizations, that the body is the source of a lot of our delusions, and by taming, in some cases even violently taming the body, you can bring the mind under control fully. Buddha had broken away from that practice, teaching for another time, to realizing that this was not adequate for attaining enlightenment. In fact, that you could, he sought out a middle way, and he'll explain that in the sutra. Sought out a middle way between the extreme of asceticism and the extreme of indulgence. And this concept of a middle way comes up in lots of different contexts. Middle way has multiple meanings, but he moved away from that extreme of asceticism towards a middle way, gained the realization of enlightenment, and with the confidence he gained, was debating whether to give teachings or not, but then decided to give teachings, and then sought out his previous companions, these 5 bhikkhus. Bhikkhu means literally like a beggar, means a monk or someone who is living as a spiritual renunciate. So bhikkhus, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What 2? The pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nirvana. So his very first teaching to these ascetics is this teaching on the middle way. And it is specifically responding to them because when he first, at one point, he decided to take an ordinary food. He ate a bowl of rice milk, milk rice, mixture of milk and rice. And that was considered indulgent, right? And so these ascetics felt like he'd given up his practice, he'd failed. So from their point of view, he was not keeping up this practice of more self-mortification. So the first thing that he says to them is, listen, there are these 2 extremes. You have successfully abandoned the extreme of indulgence. Most of us abide in the extreme of indulgence, or worldly pleasures. But they were falling into the opposite extreme of self-mortification, and he had abandoned both of those extremes, and so was advising on this middle way. So the pursuit of sensual happiness in sensual pleasures is the first extreme that he's advising against. What is so bad about the pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures, especially given that it is a whole lot of our life is spent in this way? And when we say sensual pleasures, obviously, looking at beautiful things, hearing beautiful sounds, smelling beautiful wonderful smells, tasting delightful tastes, feeling sensual objects, right? So you go to a beautiful place, there's nice music playing in the background, there's some nice, subtle, pleasant scents, you have some wonderful food, you get a massage or some nice, pleasant feeling, it's a warm, sunny day, you're in the sun and so forth. What on earth could be wrong with that? It sounds like a good time. Sounds like a very pleasant experience. And so we spend most of our time, and I would say also we spend most of our money, and we spend a lot of our mental energy trying to imagine how we can get access to these things. Now, what happens though when you have access to these things? Of course, we enjoy them, but our enjoyment wears off fairly quickly. So the initial experience of these things is very pleasant, but they get old, and they get kind of boring, and you begin to take them for granted quite quickly. And that's partly just because of the way our memory works. We notice differences. And so if something's different and pleasant, we'll notice that, and we'll be attracted to that. If it's different and unpleasant, we'll notice that and avoid it. If it's different, but once we're getting or experiencing that pleasant object, we gradually begin to forget about it or stop noticing or taking it for granted, and we become dissatisfied and then go off looking for something else that's pleasant and the next thing. And so this phenomenon where I don't want to go to that restaurant, we ate there last week, or we've eaten there a month ago or 3 months ago or whatever. I want to go to a new restaurant, right? I want to see a new movie, I want to listen to new music, right? There's this continual pursuit of novelty. Why? Not because there's anything particularly wrong with any of the original things, but we get bored, right? And the more you listen to the same song, normally, the more unpleasant it becomes. Or if you eat the same food all the time, it's like wonderful, and then kind of neutral or boring, and then at some point it's like disgusting, or you have some aversion to it. And so it keeps our mind looking for the next thing, right? But in that process of always looking for the next thing, we're not actually at peace. We're not actually in a state of stability, because wherever there is a craving for the next thing, implicitly, it's saying that where you're at right now is not pleasant. It's not satisfactory. It's not, you're not having that enjoyment, that experience of enjoyment that we want. And so it feels to us like pleasure is outside of us. And so our mind is always going out to try to get access to these pleasures, going out on the internet, buying something or looking at something, or going out of the house, or there's a lot of going out. I don't mean going out physically necessarily. I mean going out mentally, looking out there for, oh, it's a beautiful person. That looks like some nice food, nice car, whatever it is. We're going out. We're looking for something pleasant. And all the while, this looking out for something pleasant implies that what's here is not pleasant. And it implies that we're actually not in a stable state. We're not in a satisfactory state. Why? Not because there's something wrong, generally, but just because the mind of craving has arisen. So this mind of craving arises naturally, makes us seek, continuously seeking. And so that is what these ascetics had turned away from. They say, listen, these worldly people are not satisfied. They're always craving some happiness. Turning away from that, I'm going to seek internal happiness by stabilizing my mind. And with concentration, when you get control of your mind, you can achieve very profound, powerful, stable states that give rise to happiness and peace. But these ascetics were attempting to do it by doing, for example, the exact opposite. If you're normally craving pleasure, and he said, we'll willingly endure displeasure. We'll willingly endure living in a forest, getting bug bites, and lacking much food and water, and being scratched and scraped by thorns and so forth, just as we're living in this natural environment. And so because the mind craves pleasure so much, we will intentionally pursue displeasure or difficulties, and we will discipline and make our mind strong to go in the opposite direction. I recently encountered a definition of addiction from a man named, a professor named Gabor Mate, and he defined addiction. It is the cleanest, simplest definition of addiction I've ever heard, so I really like it. Addiction is actions that give temporary benefit but long-term harm, and that you can't stop. So actions or patterns of behavior that bring temporary benefit but bring long-term harm, and you cannot stop them. And so we know there's four characteristics. So first of all, it's a behavior. Addiction is a behavior. Even if it's consuming alcohol or drugs or whatever, those are behaviors that bring short-term benefit. And that short-term benefit is what causes the addiction. Addiction is always characterized by something we feel better, right? We got a high, we got a fix, we got a little educated with social media, we enjoyed ourselves with TV, whatever. There's some short-term benefit, but it brings long-term problems. And from that point of view, it brings long-term problems, which means that we are not adequately weighting the long-term benefit over the short-term benefit. Instead, we're weighting the short-term benefit over the long-term benefit. That's simply all it is. This idea of delayed gratification and making decisions rationally, pursuing long-term benefit instead of short-term benefit, that would be a wiser course of action. We feel that we are unable to, and we cannot stop. And that is the main and final characteristic of addiction. We cannot stop that pattern of behavior. And so from that point of view, of course, things like, alcohol addiction, drug addiction, sex addiction, whatever, they all fit cleanly in that definition. But also things like addiction to oil. as we say, as a society, brings short-term benefit. No question. Oil brings enormous short-term benefit to the economy and so forth, powers most of our human activity these days. Long-term disadvantages, and we cannot stop. Our addiction to plastic. In terms of the workplace, our addiction to looking busy, acting busy, even if we're not getting the main things done, even if we're not really coordinating as effectively as we can, but we, for whatever reason, can't stop. We feel like we have an obligation to keep going. This is an example of this short-term fixation that is addiction. So these ascetics were breaking their addiction to sense pleasures by willingly enduring short-term pain and discomfort to achieve their long-term aim of liberation. They were striving for liberation. And Buddha said, okay, good, you've avoided one problem, but you've gone too far to the other extreme. So his actual experience was, at some point, he noticed in meditation, spontaneously, he recalled an experience when he was 7 years old, sitting under a rose apple tree. His dad was out plowing a field. His dad was a king, a minor king, out plowing a field as a part of a village celebration of the first plowing of the field. So ceremonially, they would have the king do the first plowing activity. So it was a big celebration, a lot of activity. He was there admiring his father. He was just sitting there peacefully. And this young boy, 7-year-old Prince Siddhartha, felt this internal absorption, and he attained what's known as a jhana. So the word jhana is where we get the term Zen from. Zen Buddhism comes from this word jhana. Traditional word means absorption. He attained this first, what's called the first form realm absorption. There's 8 levels of these absorptions, but just a profound inner peace characterized by a feeling of bliss. And as a young child with no spiritual education, just having this natural experience, he's just such a feeling of well-being, such a feeling of peace, such a feeling of happiness. And so he said to himself, why am I afraid of these pleasant feelings arising in the body from just sitting here and being inwardly absorbed? This is not causing problems. It's not disturbing the mind the way craving outer sense pleasures does. Why would I be afraid of this? He said, I'm not afraid of this. I'm not afraid of this. And that this inner sense of bliss that can arise in the body is in fact to be focused on, as opposed to something to be avoided. Within the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, they take as the main focus just 2 aspects. They simplify all of Dharma down to 2 aspects: bliss and emptiness. Bliss, the inner experience of reality, the experience when your mind is fully in harmony with reality; and emptiness, the perception that arises when we have stopped all traces of dreamlike fantasy, conceptual elaboration on top of reality. These 2 aspects are seen as central, but every Buddhist tradition sees as central this inner pursuit of bliss called sukha. So many people know that, as we'll get into here, these 4 noble truths, the first of them speaks to the truth of suffering. The Sanskrit word is dukkha, but the opposite of dukkha, suffering, is sukha. Bad feeling, good feeling. That's literally all it means, sukha, bliss. So Buddha realized this bliss is something that could be achieved from inside, just inside the body. He said, what's wrong with this? There's nothing wrong with this. It's actually nourishing the body. And so he found this middle way and was advocating these ascetics, his former colleagues, to follow this middle way and not to torture their bodies. And what Bhikkhu's continuing here is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision. And here there's a bit of repetition, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, which leads to nirvana. It is this noble eightfold path. That is, and these 8 points. And this sutra, basically, these are the concepts that most people know from Buddhism. At least they know them, the terms. They don't necessarily know what they mean, or they're forget the details or fuzzy on the details, but these will be familiar. Noble Eightfold Path: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. So these 8. This bhikkhus is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata. Tathagata means gone to thatness. It's a term for Buddha. This bhikkhus is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nirvana. And so he is awakening to a middle way. So here it gives a second meaning of middle way. The first meaning of middle way is, where are you seeking your happiness? From outside or from asceticism? So that's one middle way. But immediately he's introducing this subtly different other middle way, which is a middle way which is a vision, a perception of reality. Like, what is the knowledge we need to gain? And this is an important characteristic, that liberation is attained through knowledge, but not intellectual knowledge, but through direct knowledge, through non-conceptual direct knowledge, insight. And so he indicates this Noble Eightfold Path, and that's maybe is a topic for another time, but again, well-known. It's not, that's the most well-known, or one of the most well-known aspects of the Buddhist path, is those 8. And then he proceeds to teach what are known as the Four Noble Truths. Again, everybody's heard about this, but now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union with what is displeasing is suffering, separation from what is pleasing is suffering, not getting what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. And here we're starting to get into some of the subtlety. So his explanation, this Noble Eightfold Path, the first of these is right view. And right view means understanding, seeing the world correctly. And this is wisdom. So the first 2, right view, right intention, are part of wisdom. And what is the view that we need? This view is primarily of what's known as the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, again, all Buddhist teachings can be categorized and grouped into these Four Noble Truths. And the first of them is this truth of suffering, or dukkha, as I mentioned before. And he lists these 7 sufferings: birth, aging, sickness, death, having to part with what we like, having to encounter what we do not like, having to part with what we like, and failing to satisfy our desires. So together these are known as the 7 sufferings. All of our sufferings can be, as human beings, can be grouped into that. These 4 sufferings from an outer point of view: birth is suffering. You're born crying, blood, screams, tears. Aging causes suffering, sickness causes suffering, death causes suffering, right? These are the 4 main milestones in our life. And in between, we encounter these other 3 experiences: meeting what we don't like, being separated from what we do like, and failing to satisfy our desires, meaning our desires being frustrated. And then he concludes in an interesting way. In brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are suffering. So these 5 aggregates, we will get into these. I'll be beginning by giving teachings from what are known as the Kanda Vaga. Kanda means aggregate or collection. A set of sutras about the aggregates. So I'll explain these 5 aggregates in those teachings at that time in more detail. But the 5 aggregates are basically different. Our form is the first one, which is anything that can be detected or perceived by senses, and anything which then we might collectively perceive together. So outer sense objects, multiple people can see them. I've got a glass here, I can see it, you can see it, right? This is an object that allows us to create some bridge between our 2 minds, or more minds. And then the other 4 aggregates are different aspects of the mind: feelings, knowing or experiencing something as pleasant or unpleasant, or neutral, discriminations, knowing this from that, compositional factors, which leads to actions, composing things, and then consciousness, which is really the collection of all other aspects of the mind. A lot more can be said about these 5 aggregates, but a lot more will be said about these 5 aggregates. So that's the first noble truth. The second, now this, because is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. So he defines this second noble truth we normally call origins. You might call this the truth of gathering. So the traditional meaning has a lot. It's called samudaya. It means also gathering together. But it is this characteristic. What is the root of suffering? The root of suffering is craving. And it is through craving that we accumulate that which then is subject to suffering. And what are we accumulating? We're accumulating physical entities, form, and non-physical, mental phenomena, mind. So again, very profound, and we'll get into exactly what this means and how this works. But effectively, we are growing. From the moment we're born, we continue to grow. We expand physically, we go places, we develop memories, we make connections with others, we acquire stuff. And our other mental aggregates grow as well. We have many feelings about many things, lots of knowledge. We've engaged in many activities. We have this growth stretches through the past, through the present, through the future. And this is the growth of our consciousness, effectively. Emerging into this world with a very simple world, just aware of very basic things, mom, food, pain, to growing. And this growth of the self, right? This growth of consciousness feels, well, it is life. It feels like the essence of life. But as we grow, we acquire out of craving, out of clinging. And everything that we acquire is subject to change. And as this saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. So the more we have, the more we're at risk of losing, right? And the more vulnerable we are, in fact, and the more pain, in fact, we're subject to. We need to know that, and we need to know that it is driven by craving. All of this is driven by craving. So the third noble truth. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. So this noble truth of the cessation of suffering, the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving. So the origin of this suffering is craving. The cessation of the suffering is abandoning craving. And the Theravadan teachings are very, very characterized by an emphasis on freedom from craving or non-attachment. And at least according to the Vajrayana tradition, the Hinayana teachings or Theravadan teachings are focused by, characterized by focus on non-attachment. The Mahayana teachings focused on, emphasize non-ignorance, and the Vajrayana teachings focus on non-hatred. And sometimes the latter two are reversed depending on what you're focused on. But the main point of cessation is, cessation has many levels, but once that craving ceases, then that mode of existence, that mode of our consciousness growing, ceases. And again, these are not outer behaviors. This is inner transformation. And the final fourth noble truth. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is this noble eightfold path. That is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. Listing again these noble eightfold path. So the noble eightfold path, the first of them is right view, which includes this view of what are sufferings, what are origins, as is said, as will be said later. You should know sufferings, you should abandon origins, you should attain cessation, you should practice the path. The path includes view as well as intention and action and speech and so forth. These are the path leading to this cessation of craving. This is the noble truth of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So he says these are things unheard by me before, which means that he gained this realization internally. It wasn't something that he received as a teaching. And so it's indicating that he gained an insight that he had not received from teachers before him. And it is this initial insight that is the root of Buddhism. As one of my teachers, Ajahn Sushito, says, Buddhism is composed of two parts. If you want to understand Buddhism, it's composed of two parts, Bud and ism. Bud means awakening or enlightenment and refers to this initial realization, insight, and ism is all the other stuff, all the talking, all the commentary, all the practices that's been accumulated on top of this to help people to connect with that insight, to benefit from that insight, to transmit that insight, to gain the insight. That's the ism part. Now, the Bud part, the awakening, is the essence. That's the part we really need to be focusing on. The ism is subject to change, depending on the needs of the time. So one characteristic of these teachings is that every sutra is a little bit different depending on who was talking and who they were talking to and the context, right? And so Buddhism is always evolving. And so modern Buddhism, it means a Buddhism that is oriented towards modern people and the needs of our time. So we have a new ism. We have a new ism that is needed for today. But the initial awakening, Bud, is still just as relevant. So this noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So a little bit of repetition here. This is the noble truth of suffering. This noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood, or in other words, you should know suffering. And then he repeats, or says a similar version, this noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So this kind of repetition, you'll see, it may, when you're reading it, because it's not conveying new knowledge, it may seem redundant, unnecessary, even irksome, as Bhikkhu Bodhi puts it, or annoying. The point is, if it's repeated, it means it's important, and that each of these are meditations. They're meant to be meditated on. So he says, this is sufferings. Sufferings are to be understood. And then he says, suffering has been understood. Means the path and the fruit, or the completion. And then the next one, this is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. You're getting the repetition here. And the repetition, again, originally these were memorized, recited verbally, memorized and recited verbally. And so the repetition helps with the memory, with the memorization process, but it also emphasizes the important aspects. This noble truth of the origin of suffering has been abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So in each of these cases, this is suffering. Suffering is to be understood. It has been understood. This is origin. Origins are to be abandoned. Origins have been abandoned. And now cessations. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of cessation of suffering has been realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So, you should know sufferings, you should abandon origins, you should attain cessations. Finally, the path. This is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering is to be developed. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering has been developed. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So we've gone through this 12 times, right? These three very similar verses about each of these Four Noble Truths. So at the end of this, you should remember there arose in me things unheard before. So there's something unique, new that he'd realized. It arose in him. It didn't come from outside. It arose as an insight. And these characteristics, vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, insight, light. So these terms, they're important, right? They should stick in our mind, like vision. Do I have vision? How can I get wisdom? Knowledge. Can I have knowledge? How can I get knowledge? Wisdom. Do I have that wisdom? That's the point of the repetition, is those are the points that we want to stick in our mind. So don't worry. It takes some getting used to if you're not familiar with it. But he said, so long, bhikkhus, as my knowledge and vision in 3 phases and 12 aspects. 3 phases is identifying it, making progress on it, and completing it, sometimes called basis, path, and fruit. So long as my knowledge and vision in 3 phases and 12 aspects means these 3 phases for each of the Four Noble Truths was not thoroughly purified in this way regarding these Four Noble Truths, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans. But when my knowledge and vision in 3 phases and 12 aspects was thoroughly purified in this way regarding these Four Noble Truths, then I claimed to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans. The knowledge and vision arose in me. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence. So he's making clear that there was a transition from before he had this realization. It's not claimed to be enlightened. After he had this realization, this specific realization and knowledge, an insight that was the attainment of enlightenment. Once he had that knowledge, that insight, he claimed to be enlightened. He'd become enlightened. And here, then, we're getting into 2 aspects, that then mark where I will depart from most of the traditional commentaries, and where also Professor Lee departs from most of the traditional commentaries. There are references here to supernatural beings, Maras, Devas, Brahma. Maras are like demons or obstructors. Devas are like gods, beings of light. Brahma is what we might call God, some like a state that, I mean, it is a specific Hindu god if you want, but basically it's a state that unifies all selves. So why do I indicate that I would depart from explaining things in those terms? Because those are common views of people at that time. In Buddhist time, there was a common view of the belief in Brahma, the belief in devas, these beings of, deva literally means like light or beings of light. People talked about these things as commonly as we might talk about the economy or the environment. Now, nobody has ever seen the economy. You can't see it, right? It is an abstract concept. It's an idea that we impute on a whole bunch of things, such as the, commercial activity, and no one's ever seen the environment as a whole. For example, what is the environment? It's a name that we give to this entire collection of interactions, living ecosystems, and so forth. So we live today in a world formed by concepts like democracy and nations. Nobody's ever seen a nation. Nation, again, just a concept given to a group of people living in a particular geography. But these concepts are commonplace for us today, and they're useful. They're useful concepts. We can organize a lot of discussion and understanding in these concepts. And so Buddha lived in a time where people conceived of the world in terms of these supernatural beings. And those conceptions, while from our point of view, they feel superstitious and outdated and unuseful, for people of those times, it was very useful. We may talk about the usefulness of those concepts. But that's where we begin to have a rift between people who want to focus on adopting not only the essence of Buddha's teachings, these insights on the Four Noble Truths, but also adopting some of the surrounding beliefs that surround it. And that's where I feel for Buddhism to survive into the modern world and in the future and to be relevant to us, the risk of doing that, of trying to take our entire worldview back into this worldview of Devas and Maras and Brahma and so forth, the risk of that is we'll end up compartmentalizing Buddhism into one segment of our mind. And in the rest of our mind, we will have this knowledge of like cosmology that can look anywhere in the solar system and not find Brahma, for example. It can look anywhere in the ocean and under the ground and not find Maras. And where we, our modern scientific point of view, won't see these beings, and these beings are irrelevant. Supernatural beings are irrelevant for the modern world. So if we compartmentalize Buddhism with its Maras and Brahmas and so forth from the rest of our modern education, then what we'll also be doing is we'll be compartmentalizing the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths and the Five Aggregates and all these other insights with Buddhism, and we'll be filing that away in a part of our mind that doesn't actually have relevance to what we do for a living, what we read in the news, how we talk with other people, and so forth. And so my view, and Professor Lee's view, and the view of many modern people about Buddhism, is that we need to find a Buddhism that is free from supernatural elements. That is not to say that other ways of presenting it are wrong by any means, but they're not necessarily as useful or relevant for communicating to modern people. The other aspect that I'll be breaking from compared to most traditional presentations is there's this reference, unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence. So typically Buddhism is framed in terms of past and future lives. Why? Because at the time that Buddha taught, the most common, the most prevalent view was that there was some Atman or self that never died, right? That continued from life to life to life. And that the process of liberation was may have been carried out over many lifetimes. You needed to eventually liberate this Atman and reunite it with Brahma. It was kind of the most common idea. These days, and this is effectively, this is the view of what's called the view of existence, the sense that there is a self that exists and survives death. Now, the opposite of that view is the view of non-existence, the idea that when you die, the self completely ceases. And that is much more common these days among the scientifically educated populace, that self There is no aspect of the self that continues from life to life. So my knowledge that I have right now, where did it come from? It came from some learning in this life. Did any of these tendencies come from my previous lives? Or can you perfectly explain all of my current tendencies by my genetics, my parents, my upbringing, and then the epigenetics, how my genetics have unfolded in the midst of the food and the environment that I was in throughout this life? Are explanations in terms of genetics and cultural inheritance and what's happened in this life, is that sufficient to explain everything about me without need to imagine that some of my characteristics are held over from past lives? That's much more a modern view. And in fact, here's where we have an irreconcilable difference between modern science, progressive view, and most traditional Buddhist views and most traditional religious views, which believe in at least one future life. The idea of maybe you live here in this earth and then you'll either go to heaven or hell. That's the idea of one future life. And one of the problems with this is that it is not available. It's not available to direct observation. You can't prove, you can't see directly past or future lives. So it remains just a belief. And so one religion might posit this, some other religion might posit that. And okay, that's fine. You can both posit whatever you want, but there's no way to reconcile those views because there's nothing you can observe or look at or check that could prove or disprove one of those, because it's outside of the realm of human observation in this world, in this life. That view of existence versus non-existence, Buddhism is actually focused on the middle way between them. Neither the view of existence nor the view of non-existence. But if people are starting from a view of existence, like you grew up in a society that believes in past and future lives and so forth, then great. Go ahead and believe in existence, but move towards this middle way, which we'll look at more over time, where understanding that the self is actually just a concept. That's effectively the middle way. But if you start from this view of non-existence, that the self completely ceases, you don't need to go all the way over to the other extreme of the view of existence to make your way back to this middle way. It doesn't make sense. The shortest distance from the modern scientific paradigm, the view of non-existence, the self ceases at the time of death, the shortest path between that and the middle way, views the self as just a mere conception, is not to jump all the way over to the view of existence. And so that's really what requires a very different approach to Buddhism that does not frame Buddhism in terms of past and future lives. And very controversial, but as we'll see, everything in the sutras is totally relevant, whichever starting place you come from. And Buddha, if Buddha was teaching today, my belief, if Buddha was teaching today, knowing the importance that modern people put on scientific study and direct observation and so forth, he would not frame things in terms of past and future lives. He would frame the path to the middle way in terms that modern people could understand. Of course, we don't know what Buddha would do today, but I think it's pretty clear to myself and many other people that Buddhism can be a secular path, a perfectly secular path, and the religious version of Buddhism is very problematic in this world. Just a basis for division, around beliefs. So this is what the Blessed One said. Elated, the bhikkhus of the group of five delighted in the Blessed One's statement, and while this discourse was being spoken, there arose in the Venerable Kodanya, the dust-free, stainless vision of the Dharma. He realized that whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. Whatever arises must cease. This is his insight about the essence of what Buddha was teaching. And we'll get into all of this in a lot more detail. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. So one of these five bhikkhus gained this special insight. And when the wheel of Dharma this is the way that the teachings are explained. When the wheel of Dharma had been set in motion by the Blessed One, the earth-dwelling devas raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park, at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dharma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva or Mara or Brahma, or by anyone in the world. Having heard the cry of the earth-dwelling devas, the devas of the realm of the four great kings raised a cry, and they repeat the same thing in Varanasi. So here, totally, this is cosmology, this is Buddhist cosmology, these various different kinds of devas and so forth. Again, these were common views at that time, and they all have psychological correlates that they relate to and so forth. But the point is, they're not the main point. That's the point. The point is, this is cultural context at that time, and understanding those things doesn't necessarily help us to get closer to this middle way of understanding what he was actually trying to convey. And so going through a list of many more different kinds of gods. So then having heard the cries, the devas of the realm of the four great kings, the Tavatimsa devas, the Yama devas, the Dushita devas, the Nimanarati devas, the Paranimitavasavati devas, the devas of Brahma's company raised a cry at Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana. This unsurpassed wheel of the Dharma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva or Mara or Brahma or by anyone in the world. All of what's this saying? This is saying that, listen, whatever is the pantheon of holy beings who you believe to exist, gods that are worshipped by different people, gods that represent different levels of psychological or spiritual insight, whoever are these great beings, supernatural beings, they all look at this teaching and they're like, this is amazing. This is amazing teaching. And all this is saying really is that whatever are the sources of authority and sources of influence point to this teaching as really profound. So if you're living 2,600 years ago in northeastern India, the main sources of authority are these different devas, these different gods, Brahma and so forth. If you're living in 2022 in the United States or in Europe, or wherever you're living, the main sources of authority in your world are not the Tavatimsa devas. You've never even heard of them. The main sources of authority are, governments, and politicians, and scientists, and philosophers, and celebrities, and so forth. Not that all of those sources of authority would fully appreciate these teachings, perhaps, but who would appreciate these teachings are wise people, wherever they're found in any spiritual tradition. As we'll get into, the essence of these teachings is something that anyone can appreciate. So thus, at that moment, at that instant, at that second, the cry spread as far as the Brahma world, and this 10,000-fold world system shook, quaked, and trembled, and an immeasurable glorious radiance appeared in the world, surpassing the divine majesty of the Devas. And then the Blessed One uttered this inspired utterance, Kondanya has indeed understood. Kondanya has indeed understood. So he's very, very happy that he'd understood this teaching. In this way, the Venerable Kondanya acquired the name Anya Kondanya, Kondanya who has understood. It's just basically saying this teaching was earth-shattering. And whether you like the poetic description of that, the supernatural description of that, whatever, or you just think, listen, this teaching is really, really earth-shattering. It's true. This teaching is extraordinarily profound, and we can boil it down to this one teaching that Venerable Kondanya gained, which is whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. Whatever arises must cease. And the remainder of these sutras can all be boiled into that one essence, the arising and the ceasing, the arising and the ceasing. And all of Buddha's teachings can be grouped into that and grouped into these Four Noble Truths. So thank you very much.